Haidong! In this video, we're going to talk about the essence of the Yedo forms. Once again, to make sure we're all on the same page, the Yedo forms are the forms that usually come after Sangsu, and this is usually happening when you are in your second degree forms. So first, let's talk about what the Federation actually says about this style. Oddly enough, of the three styles, this is the one that the Federation has the most to say, but also kind of weird, right? So let's take a look at those two major pieces of information. The first piece of information allegedly is that this was designed for assassins, so that's kind of the word that's been used. So it's an assassin style. Now what that might mean is a little bit harder to tell, right? But just so you know, that's what the Federation is saying. I can digest it a little bit in the future, but for now, that's the information that we're given. The other piece of information is that we are using a Yedo, right? So that means it is going to be a short sword. Now what that means differs for everyone else. So the general conception that I've heard is that it's mostly, again, what we usually use, this is not Korean, that's fine, is a normal sword with a normal length hilt, but a shorter blade, right? So you still have the full functional use of the hilt, but the blade itself is actually shorter. As usual, this is the point where I kind of tell you, these are my own musings, right? So aside from those two pieces of information that I just told you, I told you about all that has been told to me specifically. Anything beyond those two pieces is going to be my own musings, my own ideas, my own crazy, concepts that I've been playing with. But yeah, so just keep that in mind. So anything past the fact that's an assassin style and that uses a short sword is going to be my own weirdness, right? So let's first talk about that first idea, right? So it's an assassin style. So that could mean a few different things. That might mean it's more of an interior use, right? So as opposed to Sangsu, which was originally intended for, big combat, right? So I'm in the middle of a field or something like that, doing combat. So maybe that might mean we're doing stuff inside, and that's potential, right? So for example, you do a lot more sliding and shifting in the Yedo than you do in Sangsu. Sangsu is usually a lot more stepping with things. So maybe that might be something, right? So maybe you're a little bit more constrained on space. But that is at least one idea that phrasing, right? So the phrasing is an assassin style. But that's at least one idea. Another idea is that it's for close range, right? Because a lot of these techniques are like, there's that backward stab that we do. There's a lot of the other, again, close-ish range cuts and stuff like that. So maybe that's what they mean. But at that point, it's like, well, if you're an assassin, you probably don't want to be close range with the person you're trying to assassinate, right? That seems a little bit weird, right? So that portion of it might be a little bit wonky. And yet another way you can think of it is maybe it is an infiltration kind of so instead of assassin, if you want to think of it as infiltration, right? So you're kind of like one person amid, again, probably a small enclosure of you battling out, like duking it out with people, unfortunately at close range. That might be, again, another way you can interpret this whole thing. So again, I've sort of flavored this a little bit already, but by calling it an assassin style seems to kind of miss the mark a little bit of what this style can do. This style is very useful, is really nice in terms of, again, fluidity, and it has its own flavor to it. But again, calling it an assassin style gives it a weird, I keep saying flavor, gives it a weird flavor, right? Because when you think of an assassin, you don't think about, someone's, I guess you might think someone really close up, shank, shank, shank. But like real assassins back in the day, and probably still today, who knows, probably don't want to be there, right? They won't be like face to face with you. So it'll be a lot more long distancey things, which isn't what Yedo does. Yedo is actually pretty getting close range. I mentioned this quite a few times. So calling an assassin style is a little bit wonky, at least in my opinion, just because it, again, misses the mark of what this style can really do in general, right? Now that I've thoroughly annoyed anyone who was in love with the idea of doing an assassin style, let's talk about the fact that we're using a shorter sword. Again, Yedo does mean short sword, so that's probably going to be a major attribute of it. So I also mentioned what I've been told the piece of equipment should be. Again, normal length hilt, but shorter blade. But yeah, so let's kind of like dive into that a little bit more. And before I even go that far into it, at this point, I don't know if this is going to break the rhythm, but at this point I do want to make sure if you are playing with these ideas, maybe even pause the video and try doing the Yedo form with a short sword, right? Because allegedly if this form was, or this style was developed for shorter swords, and you don't use a shorter sword, that seems like you're probably missing something, right? So at this point, I would recommend, if you haven't done it before, try doing the Yedo forms with a short sword, and from there, we can have at least a common ground from which we can start talking about concepts in detail. Now that you've gone through that form with a short sword, you might notice a few things that might happen, right? So now if you're just going through the form and not, again, applying it against a person, not that much has changed, right? So it might feel weird, definitely, but again, like, nothing really changed so far. But when you do start to apply it, right, there's going to be some techniques in there, and again, the style in general, that doesn't seem to work with a shorter blade, right? So for example, I'm thinking about like the thrusts, right? So we usually end with that nice horizontal thrust, right? But if we're using a short sword, and I'm allegedly going into someone's body, right? And even if I'm like shoulder into his chest, if the shorter blade's like here, that's right? So I'll have to like kind of twist to get even more into it, but in the form, we just end here, right? So that seems to be an issue, right? So if we're using a shorter blade, we obviously won't be able to get further into the body, and especially with all these close range combinations, it's not going to be that effective. And there's going to be other couple things, right? So for example, the clearing motion, I'm thinking about form 5, for example. If you have a shorter blade and you're doing that clear, if it's a shorter blade, you're not going to get that much reach in terms of, again, warding people off. So at this point, there are a few things that are like, all right, it means short sword. I have tried using a short sword. Why does it feel like things are not doing the things that I thought they should be doing, right? So at this point, I'm going to take an outside source and play with a new idea. At this point, I've referenced this book a few times. At least a few of the Gumdo masters many of the Gumdo masters I've talked to are at least aware of this book. But it's an idea for us to play with ideas. So if you're not familiar with it, huzzah, right? So it's the Comprehensive Illustrated Manual of Martial Arts of Ancient Korea. That seems to be right down our alley. It is by Sang H. Kim, who allegedly has a PhD. So again, I'm just going to use this as a reference. I'm not going to change anything about the actual Yedo forms or anything like that. But this will at least give us an idea about maybe some terminology, right? So again, based off this, let's talk about the idea of what Yedo means. So Yedo means short sword, but shorter than what? So at least if you, again, go with that source, I'm pointing over there because that's where the book is. And also if you kind of agree with my idea that the Sangsu forms use, again, a longer sword. And by longer, I mean body length, right? So maybe the sword was originally developed for body length swords. There's in fact a sword called the Sangsu, so Sangsu Gum, and that is kind of what I'm talking about, right? So it's about this high, really long blade, right? So Yedo might just mean shorter than that, shorter than a body length blade. Now that obviously includes a lot of things, right? So what that would also mean is that the blades that we normally work with, right? So again, a blade like this count, right? So this is in fact shorter than body length, right? So something like that might work, right? So if we do that and we kind of go through the Yedo forms with our normal, again, mukgum or jingum or something like that, like we are already doing the form as it was potentially intended, right? So for example, if we take a look again at those combinations, if I stab this way, that's enough length to get into someone's rib, right? Maybe even get into the heart if I'm really aiming high, but that's enough to do that damage. That's enough for us to do that clearing motion, at least enough to get enough space so you can do something about it. And there's another one, right? So if we do the vertical cuts in number 4, right? So if we do something like this, if we do that with a short sword, again, the target area, so canonically it's going the opposite direction of a center cut, but I usually think that you're cutting open the inside of the leg because there are some fun arteries in there that you can sever. But if we do that with a short sword, we're gonna miss, right? Because it is in fact shorter and not gonna be able to hit the target, versus if we're using a standard length blade, it's fine, right? So it's able to hit that target, cut through, and I'm not too worried about that. So at least according to that book, using a standard length sword, at least the one that we probably already are using, count as Yedo. So at this point, you might be like, all right, like, so first of all, you're not quite ignoring what the Federation says, but you're kind of playing with what they're saying. But also like, so then why make the distinction, right? So why differentiate the Sangsu style from the Yedo style if at least according to the Federation, we use about the same thing, right? So we use the same sword for all 3 styles. So, all right, so like, why are you making this distinction between Sangsu style and Yedo style? That's actually going to be, again, so this is going to be me, not Federation. I guess not contradictory to the Federation necessarily, but where I'm going to be going with this is potentially, right, so the Sangsu were developed for heavier weapons, maybe the Yedo are intended for lighter weapons. I'm going to say lighter as opposed to shorter, right, because as we mentioned before, with those specific techniques, as well as techniques in general, we want that length for, again, those reasons. So I can actually hit the targets because I'm hitting not the normal targets that we used to hit for Sangsu, right? Sangsu, we were aiming primarily for the head or the shoulder and occasionally for the cross in order just to ward someone off. Yedo, we're actually aiming a little bit more on the upward direction, right? We're doing a lot more close range stabs. We do need that length in order to do a sufficient amount of damage. So it's not going to be the length that's going to be that much different, at least if you're not using a Sangsu for a Sangsu. So let's talk about using a lighter weapon. And actually at this point I'm going to introduce the idea of, and this is also weird, that the Yedo was actually intended initially for one-handed sword styles. The traditionalists already had probably flipped their tables, turned off the screen, and left, so I guess at this point I can just keep talking. Right, so let's try going through the Yedo with one-handed weapons, right? So again, I'm going to be using a Chinese broadsword, which is, again, lighter, is intended to be one-handed, but the length is actually not that much different from our standard length, right? So from our Kagum, our Jingum, our Mukkum, it's not that much different. So let me kind of show you a couple of those combinations that, again, I was kind of complaining about, and let's see if they work, right? So this is the Chinese broadsword that I'm going to be using. So let's take a look at some of those Yedo combinations and again see if they're fixed, see if they don't make any sense whatsoever, or hey, if it works, let's try it. So the first one we mentioned was just stabbing behind you, right? So now with this particular weapon, with the floppiness, probably the stab is not going to be that great, right? So on that account, maybe not, but in terms of length, the geometry of the stab seems fine, right? Let's try again that 360 clear, right? So make contact, clear through. Easy, right? So there's no problem with that. And likewise with our vertical cut. Easy, right? So now let me show you a few more combinations I think that I showed in the Sangsu and kind of see, or the Sangsu video, if they work with one-handed combinations. That felt almost obnoxiously nice, right? So as you're able to go through it, you have that nice big motion, right? So the idea is if we do agree that's an assassin style, right? And that we're kind of either infiltrating and that we're surrounded, if we maintain 2 hands on a short weapon, you get next to no reach, right? Versus one-handed, right, with a standard length, we get a lot of reach, right? So even if we do something with like this clearing motion, right? So clear, reach, reach. And also notice how much that reaching motion helps with your stance. Going around, bang, bang, thrust, right? Versus if we do the same thing with a two-handed, now granted the hilt is shorter, notice just how much shorter the range is. Now we might get more control over it, but that's probably because we, again, in general as Gumdosa, don't practice with, again, one-hand stuff that often. So probably what I would say is if you go through Yedo with a, again, single-edged, right, so double-edged doesn't really work that well because we do half sorting, but so long as you do it with a single-edged blade, ideally curved, Yedo forms using this kind of weapon work really, 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 really well. So you can probably imagine, this is going to be one of your drills at the end, is to try going through Yedo with a one-handed, ideally curved, sword. Or you can just try it with your mukam, again with one hand, and really feel how your body, or how the sword can actually facilitate your ability to go through the form. Now in case you think I just pulled it out of thin air, taking a look at this book, right? So when it does talk about Yedo, it talks about 3 different potential styles that Yedo could mean. Guess what's one of them, right? So one of them is actually going to be very similar to the Chinese broadsword that I was using before, right? So there's at least some background for that, so I'm not completely insane. At least I'm taking my insanity from other people. Right, so just so you know, right? So I like to cite my sources, and this was one of my sources in terms of using the Chinese broadsword for our Yedo forms. Also remember that again, the purpose of these videos aren't necessarily to just give you raw information, right? They're also to, again, tease ideas out of you, right? So you you may not have heard like, oh, try this form doing one-handed. Try it, right? Try going through a Sangsu one-handed. That was a drill from last week, potentially. Right, so try going through a form using 2 hands, using one hand, using a long weapon, using a short weapon. Again, kind of feel what each style is really working for, right? So, as you can probably imagine, the drills for this week are going to actually be very similar, if not the same, of the other one, right? So I mentioned, so I'm actually going to do another video about the more stylistic choices, the combat choices of Yedo, so there's probably going to be a part 2 in the future. But for now, based on the background that you might now have, think about these, right? So think about going through a Yedo form using, again, we talked about like a 50-50 weight, using your body to throw, using your sword to throw your cut around, using your body to throw your cut around. So try shifting those percentages again a little bit more. Try, now specifically for this video, try doing a sword, or try doing Yedo one-handed, right? So I mentioned that I really, really like it. You may not, right? So you may have seen this and you say like, that looks really funky. Try it for yourself, right? So once you do, again, you don't have to agree with me. The idea is to spread ideas and try to spread good practices. And that is something that I actually do believe. I do believe that Yedo was originally developed in terms of one-handed sword, right? But it was modified so that, again, people continuing from Sangsu would have probably an easier time of transitioning to Yedo. That is something that I do firmly believe, but you're also allowed to disagree with me. And also likewise, try going through your forms with, again, different weights and all that kind of fun stuff, different weight swords, different length swords, so you can kind of, again, see all that fun, usual stuff. But with that, make sure you keep training and stay humble. Haidong!